Who is the weakest Pokemon in all of RBY? Well, I don't know actually. Give me a minute. Let's have a look. That one. There you go. It's that one. Thanks for watching. Jokes aside though, one of the more common complaints about competitive Pokemon, typically from people who don't play competitive Pokemon, is that it sort of goes against the spirit of Pokemon, because generally, you have to stick to whatever's good within a specific meta, rather than just using your favorite Pokemon and winning with that. And at least for Smogon singles, I always thought it was a pretty stupid argument. Like, yes, especially if you're a new player, you should generally stick to the meta. I understand that that might seem a bit boring, and that, you know, funny niche Pokemon can be very tempting, but if you're a new player, it's harder to recognize where you can apply the niches these Pokemon have, or get into situations where that niche applies at all. The thing is though, yes, you should generally stick to whatever Pokemon are good and consistent within a specific meta, but like, do you have any fucking idea how many metas there actually are? Like, surely you like something that's good somewhere, right? Do you only have eyes for Wailord when it comes to competitive Pokemon? Generation 3 never used. They're great there. Go on, have fun. Does your appreciation of the Pokemon franchise as a whole hinge entirely on the funny walking boy? Well, you'll be pleased to hear that they've been walking over the entirety of Generation 2 PU for quite a while now, so there you go. Check that out. I'm telling you, if you look around, chances are a Pokemon you really like is surely going to be good somewhere. Like, if all the people trying to make Charizard work in Generation 1 Overused just packed their bags and jumped ship to Generation 3 Overused, the world would be so much better. I'm telling you. Generation 3 Charizard is like the only time Charizard has been cooler ever. He's so badass there. Bro spent all of Generation 4 and 5 being scared of some fucking stones, and he was only good in Generation 6 with some under-the-counter help from Game Freak. In Generation 3, bro looked at all the top threats in Generation 3 Overused and was just like, fuck it, I'm going to become a boss character. Unless you're strictly a Pokemon fan because of shit like Love Disc, surely something you enjoy is cooking somewhere. And also, I feel like playing competitive Pokemon can also just make you appreciate certain Pokemon more. Like, I guarantee you, before trying it in RBY Overused, I hadn't thought about Kingler a single time in my fucking life. But like, then I took a 30% gamble versus a Starmie, and I've never looked back since. Kingler's badass. I like them. You might be surprised to find out just how many Pokemon have a chance to shine in Generation 1. Like, of course, you've got Overused and, you know, Underused, Never Used, the Ubers, they've been around for a while, and certain Pokemon are good there, certain Pokemon have niches there, but like, Generation 1's lower tiers have been getting a ton of love lately. Generation 1 PU has been marinating for a while now, and it's quickly become one of my favorite tiers of all time. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with my undying love for Pinsir. Confident and a leader. Both of those are wrong. But that's not strictly because of its questionable viability in Overused. No, I use it all the time in PU, because it's genuinely fucking great in PU, and it's really fun. I played in a tournament for RBY PU a while back, and I had a ton of fun. And it made me appreciate a lot of Pokemon that I had never really thought about before, like Rapidash and Seaking, Drowsy. I don't know, it was fun. If you're wondering how I did, I mean, it could have gone worse, but it was also the reason I made this tweet. So, you know, it's not that bad, all things considered, I guess. Things don't end at PU either. RBYZU is very much a thing. It's still pretty early days, and things fluctuate a lot as, you know, new Pokemon drop from PU and stuff like that. But it's still very interesting, and I'm curious to see how it develops. A lot of Pokemon that really do not come to mind when you think of RBY have had a good chance to shine in ZU, such as Pidgeot, Onix, Marowak, and I know at some point Arbok was a fucking problem in the tier, and then Ghastly was also arguably an even bigger problem, and then it got banned, which is just so funny to me because it means at multiple points in time, there are 3 tiers in RBY that had a poison type as the best Pokemon in the tier, which is just so un-RBY, I kind of love it. And of course, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, there's RBY 7U, which is still going strong today. Now, It's been nearly a year since I originally made that 7U video, and a lot has changed since then. Such as my lighting. Like, I know my lighting is still bad, but like, Jesus Christ, fuck what's going on here. A lot of very talented players have taken a liking to 7U, and in that time, there's been a lot of pretty significant meta shifts. Meowth is still pretty solidly the king, and Pokemon like Charmeleon and Tentacool are as great as ever. However, Golbat, which back then I think was considered around like top 6, is now very solidly a top 3 or potentially top 2 threat. And honestly, it doesn't even matter what variation of top and then a number I put for this thing, because it's on every fucking good team regardless. Golbat is fucking nasty. These stats are just too damn good for 7U. It's really fast, it's pretty damn bulky, it hits pretty damn hard too. It's also got Confuse Ray, which is annoying as all hell, and like, its weaknesses look bad, but in 7U they're honestly pretty manageable. Clefairy is another Pokemon that had a massive jump in viability, jumping up to like around 5th or 6th. Like, yeah, it's still slow and these stats aren't amazing, but the amount of utility that Clefairy brings to the table is unmatched. Out of all the Pokemon in 7U that have access to Sleep and Paralysis, Clefairy is by a long shot the best, and that's a big deal, because Pokemon not scared of one can be pretty significantly scared by the other. Granted, Clefairy does rely on Sing for sleep, which is not the most consistent thing in the world, but its viability does not hinge on Sing. It doesn't even always run Sing. It's just another tool in Clefairy's excellent arsenal. Blizzard smacks the shit out of Golbat, doing over 40% minimum, which can put Golbat in a very scary spot, especially if it's taken a little bit of chip damage or recoil from Double Edge. Counter is great for smacking something like an unsuspecting Meowth. Thunder Wave and Body Slam are great for paralysis and solid damage, and there's always Psychic, which has pretty decent coverage in 7U. Clefairy is just a really solid Pokemon, and it's really started to shine over time, which you love to see it. There have also been some other pretty significant jumps in viability, such as Farfetch'd and Kabuto, which I really didn't see coming. You'd love to see that, but there have also been some drops. Ivysaur fell off a little bit. It's still a very consistent sleeper, but the lack of utility outside of sleep kind of drags it down. It's got a couple good matchups, but, you know, it's still solid, but has fallen off a bit over time. Also, I am not saying that Ivysaur falling off is strictly related to Clefairy, especially not Sing Clefairy, but I do think it's kind of funny that as the top tier grass type known for using Sleep Powder fell off, people were exploring other options on a certain round pink Pokemon with a great utility move pool that may or may not include Sing. You know what I'm getting at? Like, we've seen something like this before. I don't know. Also, unfortunately, speaking of falling off in 7U, Beedrill. Beedrill fell off really fucking hard. I think in that old video it was at like 7th. No, yeah, Beedrill is kind of buns. It really just does not. People found out pretty quickly that it was just kind of ass. Like, it really struggles to set up given how fast-paced 7U is. And if it doesn't, it just doesn't really threaten that much. It's got a couple good matchups. It's not complete garbage, but yeah, you really do hate to see it. Now, you might be wondering, Yellow, why the fuck are you telling me any of this? You're just talking about tiers. What does this have to do with the weakest Pokemon in RBY? Well, the reason I'm talking about all of this is because there's sort of kind of a tier for the potential weakest Pokemon in RBY. See, there are sort of tiers below 7U. They are mostly hypothetical, but they sort of kind of exist. RBY 8U is like sort of kind of nearly but not quite a thing. People do occasionally play it and people do occasionally talk about it, and when I say they talk about it, I'm not just referring to people who hop into the RBY Discord and go, yes, excuse me, can we get a dedicated channel for this tier I won't play, please? Thank you. Don't do that. Begging you, don't do that. I will be upset, I will feel responsible, I just play some OU, play some UU, just don't do that. Begging you. From what I understand, a big thing holding a potential 8U back is the lack of like an official cutoff point between 7U and 8U. Like, there's a little bit of debate over whether Pokemon like Geodude or Beedrill would be allowed in 8U or if they should stay in 7U. Which is like, Man, Beedrill really cannot catch a fucking break, huh? It's kinda sad. I have actually played a couple games of 8U, but because of this, I'm not sure if I played the real 8U, because when I played it with my friends, we allowed Geodude, so it's kinda up in the air. Funnily enough, I thought Mankey would be, like, top 1 in 8U. It absolutely wasn't. It wasn't that great. Which is weird, because it means that at some point in time, I have vastly overrated the viability of both members of the Primeape family in RBY. Like, there was the thing with Mankey in 8U, and when I was playing in that RBY PU tournament, I nearly considered running Primeape as a potential answer to Staryu, because it's faster and has Thunderbolt. That's not real. Primeape is pretty buns. But yeah, weird little coincidence there. Below RBY 8U, you have RBY 9U, which is just the same thing, but even more made up and hypothetical and not really a thing. RBY 9U would probably be ruled by Pokemon like Squirtle and Spearow. Yeah, it's really kind of fucking out there. And again, just like 8U, we don't even really know for sure what's actually allowed in 9U. People just haven't really thought about it. And honestly, it doesn't really need to be thought about. It is what it is. However, unlike RBY 8U and RBY 9U, there is actually a pretty universally agreed upon list of legal Pokemon for RBY 10U, which I have also lovingly heard referred to as RBY No U. RBY No U consists of 6 Pokemon, meaning that there is exactly one possible team within the tier, and that team consists of Caterpie, Metapod, Weedle, Kakuna, Ditto, and Magikarp. Yeah, this is really where we're at now. So you might be thinking that to find out who the weakest Pokemon in RBY is, you would simply look at whoever the worst Pokemon in RBY 10U is. And that's kind of, sort of the case. There's a little bit of grey area, we'll touch on that. Okay, see, you know how in RBY, there's a few Pokemon that are like, great in never used, have a niche in overused, but they're kind of dogshit and underused. There's actually a couple examples of this, like Golem, Kingler, Porygon. We've sort of got something like that here. You see, out of the 6 available Pokemon in 10U, 2 of them sort of kind of have a niche in higher tiers. Ditto has a fucking microscopic niche in Ubers of all things, and Magikarp has a niche in a tier you may not have ever heard of called Pika Cup. It's a bit of a weird tier that originates from Pokemon Stadium. Now you might be wondering what these niches actually are, and I'm not telling you, because I found out about these niches by watching the cool new Reverend video where he talks about both of them. So yeah, you should go watch that. If you've already seen it, fantastic. If you haven't, you got 24 hours before I send the boys over. You could argue that having these niches in other tiers means that both of these Pokemon are out of the running for being the weakest Pokemon in RBY. Although, regardless, I don't necessarily think it matters that much, because I don't think either of these Pokemon are the best or worst in RBY 10U. I think they're both kind of in the middle, maybe, I'm not totally sure. I'll be real, I didn't ask other people to play 10U with me for this, which you might be disappointed by. But listen, I'm not good at talking to people as is, so I would be especially not good at asking people to play this shit with me. It's really boring. This is not a recommendation to play 10U. Please don't. Don't get me wrong, I have played 10U with people in the past. It's just that I think everyone wants to move on from that. 10U, as I'm sure you can imagine, is absolutely zero fun to play. It is really boring. On top of being incredibly boring to play, you might also find that RBY 10U is weirdly complicated to play due to some legality issues. Namely, Kakuna being unable to learn Harden alongside Poison Sting and String Shot without tradebacks, and there's a number of issues with Magikarp due to one of its 3 available moves coming from a Japan-only event. For the sake of this video, I'm ignoring all of this just because I think it's more interesting if all of these mons have everything that's available to them, but if you ever feel like tricking your friends into playing 10U with you, you might want to do things differently. So, out of the 4 remaining Pokemon, who is the worst? Well, it's definitely not these 2, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so basically, the meta of 10U basically comes down to Kakuna and Weedle using Poison Sting to poison the 4 Pokemon that are susceptible to Poison Sting, and then just wailing on each other and hoping for crits. Yeah, it's pretty sad. This might seem weird because Poison is notoriously terrible in RBY, but the issue with Poison in RBY is less so that it's weak, only doing 1/16 of the opponent's health per turn, and more so that by poisoning the opponent, you've effectively given them an immunity to the actual impactful statuses in RBY, those being paralysis and sleep. But in Tenyu, Kakuna and Weedle's poison is the only status, and therefore it is absolutely worth spreading, especially since that 1/16 of the opponent's health per turn is actually pretty comparable to the actual damage you'd be doing in Tenyu. With one exception I'll touch on in a bit, there are exactly 3 attacks in Tenyu: Tackle, Poison Sting, and Struggle. You're really, at best, looking at a bunch of 8-hit KOs, maybe a 7-hit KO, and a lot of that is only thanks to Poison Sting being super effective against Bug in Generation 1. You might be wondering whether Weedle or Kakuna is better here, and honestly, I don't think it really matters. Like, they're kind of interchangeable, but I would probably say that Kakuna is more impactful. Weedle does a little bit more damage and is a little bit faster, thus having a higher crit rate. Both have access to String Shot for speed control and I guess stalling turns. However, Kakuna also has Harden, which is actually a pretty big deal considering that it's immune to being poisoned in a tier that, with one exception, consists entirely of physical attacks, meaning that you're really not breaking through it without crits, or without the help of someone else. You see, against a hardened Kakuna, you do have one saving grace, and that's actually Magikarp. You see, in Generation 1, Magikarp, on top of having Tackle and Splash, actually learns Dragon Rage through an event. This sounds a lot cooler than it actually is, unfortunately, because it's only an 8-hit KO against the entire tier, except against another Magikarp where it's a 7-hit KO. With Magikarp, I really do think you want to try your best to just save your Dragon Rages for Kakuna. Like, the damage isn't great, it's still only an 8-hit KO, but it's consistent damage against a Pokemon that is immune to the only status in the tier that has access to Harden to boost its defense. So, it's better than nothing. And also, while it's not doing a ton of damage, that damage is at the very least going to stick, because there's no healing in Tenyu at all. If you're desperate, Magikarp is also the fastest Pokemon in the tier, which means it has the highest crit rate in the tier. So, if you ever run out of Dragon Rages, maybe fishing for crits versus Kakuna is your best shot. I will say though that Magikarp probably falls off pretty damn hard if you're being strict about legality in Tenyu. Namely because Dragon Rage is incompatible with Tackle, so you have to pick one or the other, and due to the lack of Harden on Kakuna. Harden Kakuna is like your main target with Dragon Rage, so without that, Magikarp really doesn't have anywhere near as much to do. You might be wondering if you want to save any Dragon Rages for Metapod, and I really don't think so. Metapod is not immune to being poisoned, so that's probably how it's going to die. Whether it sets up Harden or not, I don't think it really matters. Ditto in RBY Tenyu is a bit of a weird case, because a lot of its key issues don't really come into play in the tier. A lot of the issues with Ditto stem from its terrible base stats before it transforms, but by Tenyu standards, these are totally fine. Ditto retaining its base HP after transforming is totally fine here because it has the second highest HP in the tier after Metapod, and it's also the 3rd fastest Pokemon in the tier after Kakuna and Magikarp, so it's not as hard to get a transform off. I think what Ditto wants to do is just transform into Kakuna or Weedle, and then just try and chip away at them with Poison Sting. You've only got 5 of them, and you're not going to be doing very much damage at all, but at least while you're transformed into them, you can't get poisoned, so that's something. Also, Ditto has a bit of a weird quirk that actually helps it in these matchups. You see, when transformed into the opponent, Ditto actually keeps its base critical hit rate. Now, this is slightly lower than Weedle's, but it's a good bit better than Kakuna's. And also, if Ditto does land a crit while transformed, the damage of the crit is actually calculated using Ditto's base stats, not the base stats of the Pokemon it transformed into. This is useful because Ditto's base attack is higher than both Kakuna and Weedle. At the end of the day though, Ditto isn't anything that special, and there's also the fact that if it does get poisoned before transforming, it's kinda just done. It's not that great, but it's definitely not the worst in Tenyu, I'd say. Also, one kind of funny thing about Ditto is if by some miracle you run out of transforms, because Ditto is a normal type, and in Generation 1 Struggle is a normal type move, Ditto's Struggle is actually the strongest attack in Tenyu. So yeah, if by some miracle that actually like comes into practice, good luck getting that 87% chance to 4-hit KO Weedle. So with all that said, that leaves us with 2 contenders for the weakest Pokemon in RBY. Caterpie and Metapod. And believe it or not, at least in the context of Tenyu, I think it might actually be Metapod.
So this is my life. At least I've done better than Dad.
That might seem like a weird thing to say, given that Metapod is the evolved form of Caterpie, but like, all these Pokemon can do is just chip away at Weedle and Kakuna with Tackle until they get poisoned and eventually die. And at the end of the day, Caterpie's like a little bit better at that. Caterpie has a better speed stat, giving it a higher crit rate and notably letting it outspeed Kakuna, and it has a higher attack stat, meaning it just does a little bit more damage, so it might end up having a little bit more of an impact over the course of a game. I'm not entirely sure which is worse, because at the end of the day, Metapod will probably get the opportunity to fire off more tackles than Caterpie, even if they're not doing as much damage, but in the context of Tenyu, one of them is definitely the weakest Pokemon in RBY. So that's it, right? Metapod or Caterpie is the weakest Pokemon in RBY, right? Well, I'm sorry to say after all of this, but I'm really not sure. Everything I've been talking about is in the context of Tenyu, and at the end of the day, Tenyu is a fucking dead fish in the ocean that is RBY. It's very weird and very specific, and the one possible meta within Tenyu just kind of happened to suit Weedle and Kakuna. So as a result, Caterpie and Metapod kind of got fucked over. Like, listen, if you dropped Caterpie and Weedle in pretty much any other tier, I'd say Caterpie would be better off. Tackle is generally going to be doing more damage than Poison Sting, and there's also the fact that Caterpie's one means of dealing damage doesn't come with a 20% chance to inflict a status that will actually help the opponent in the long run by making them immune to the likes of Paralysis, Sleep, and Freeze. Like, Poison just so happens to work in Tenyu because it's the only status. Anywhere else, Poison is dog, and therefore Weedle is worse than Caterpie. And looking past Smogon singles for a minute, you could argue that Magikarp is also down there as potentially the weakest Pokemon in RBY, because along with Metapod and Caterpie, it can't fucking beat the game that it's from. Struggle is a normal type attack in Generation 1, so it means that if you're trying to beat the game with just one of these 3 Pokemon, your run will end at Pokemon Tower because of the ghost types, unless you're using like excessive glitches. But then again, you could also say that there's no way Magikarp could be the weakest Pokemon in RBY, because just evolve it into Gyarados, dumbass. Like, you get what I'm getting at here. There's just too many ways to look at these Pokemon to have a definitive weakest Pokemon in RBY. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that...
It don't matter. None of this matters.
Listen, who is the weakest Pokemon in RBY is a fun question to ask yourself and, like, think about for a couple minutes. But it is a weirdly difficult question to answer, and more importantly, it's just not a question that needs answering. It really doesn't matter. RBY is cool as fuck. There's a lot of really cool tiers to play, there's a lot of really cool Pokemon to use in those tiers, and if you get wrapped up in it enough, sooner or later you're gonna meet some pretty fucking cool people too. So, just enjoy RBY for the things about RBY that are cool. Don't get hung up on Caterpie versus Metapod, it ain't worth it. So, to wrap things up, thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and most importantly, stop using Charizard in Overused.